You're listening to Money Talks on the Chorus Radio Network. Very pleased to welcome back to the show Lance Roberts, General Partner, Chief Portfolio Strategist for STA Wealth Management. But I know him as the host of Street Talk with Lance Roberts. By the way, he's also the Chief Editor of The X Factor, and I'll tell you how to get a hold of that for our Money Talks audience in just a moment's time. But first, Lance, thanks for finding time this weekend.
Of course, absolutely. How are you today?
Good. Glad to have you back with us. I'm just going to hop right into it, a couple of things here. Let's start with the macro level here. Talk about the Federal Reserve. I mean, we've been having will they, won't they about raising interest rates for so darn long. You know, this is the longest running soap opera, but it does probably the pivotal thing that market watchers have got the pulse of, keep their eye on.
Well, it is true. And here's what's really funny about this. I wrote an article last week on the website talking about GDP and the fact that the Bureau of Economic Analysis has now come out and said, well, you know, we found some problems with our numbers. We need to readjust the math. There's some residuals to the seasonality formulas that we used, so we need to fix those. What I wrote last week was I find the timing of this extremely odd. Remember, about 2 years ago, in 2013, the BEA came out and added in intellectual property into GDP, which boosted GDP by almost $500 million. That was to get, you know, the growth rate up. And the reason I say this is all very curious is that because here's the Fed, you know, this will we, won't we raise interest rates. They are determined to raise interest rates, but they can't seem to quite get the economic backdrop to cooperate with them. So I find it interesting now the BEA is going to boost economic growth by, adjusting the math. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to wake up, in July and all of a sudden have more money in your account. It just means that the GDP is going to register higher, and this will give the Fed some wiggle room, so to speak, to raise interest rates. Yellen's been very clear. She's going to raise interest rates in June, and I think that's a real possibility at this next meeting.
It is interesting, though. I mean, I link it back to, people have to understand, how the employment numbers, for example, are manufactured. They don't count anybody who hasn't had a job interview in a month. They don't count anybody who has been out of work for 6 months. And presto, that makes your employment situation look a lot rosier when you ignore 93 million permanently unemployed people in the States.
Well, that's absolutely right. We've got 100 million on some form of welfare. And, what most people don't know is that under the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton and several of the other kind of individuals working inside the government needed a better employment outlook at that time so that they could do some of the other changes that they wanted to make. And so what they did is they got rid of what was originally called the U7 report. Now, most people don't remember the U7 report, but it reported everybody that was unemployed for longer than 52 weeks. So we took all those people off the roll immediately. We took 500,000 people out of account, and that made employment look better. Well, here's the problem. Since this current administration came into office in 2008, we extended unemployment claims. We allowed people to claim unemployment for 99 weeks, which took them far past the 52 weeks, which you're absolutely right. When you look at the employment numbers now, we've had a record number of people falling out of the rolls. They're simply not counted because they're still taking some form of government welfare that's actually giving them more money than what they would get by actually working a job.
You know what was incredible about that move in the States when they extended the unemployment benefits? I think it was done by Larry Summers. I think it was him. But they had already done research. He himself had been part of the research project that showed that when you extended to a certain period of time, the likelihood of ever getting a job again was dramatically reduced. So they did that with their eyes wide open, literally saying, hey, we're going to extend the unemployment insurance claims and period, and we know you'll probably never get back to the workforce.
Exactly.
I mean,
well, and that's
wow.
that's exactly what we've seen actually come into occurrence. In the United States right now, a woman, as an example, is better off working a $27,000 a year job and getting roughly about $40,000 a year in government benefits versus actually working a $60,000 a year job and paying taxes.
Wow.
That is the problem that we have in America today. You're paid to stay home.
I'm talking with Lance Roberts, General Partner, Chief Portfolio Strategist for STA Wealth Management. Also, he's the chief editor of the X Factor Investment Letter. Hey, Lance, let's come back to that first statement. You're saying you're looking for the Feds to raise rates. Can the market withstand an increase? Have they sent enough signals for us to anticipate and take any moves we wanted to make in advance of that?
Okay, well, first of all, let's keep some things in perspective. Two things. One, a interest rate hike from a quarter of a basis point to say even a half a basis point is not really substantially enough to have, sharp ramifications through the economy. There's also a misnomer that just because the Fed raises interest rates, that interest rates in the 10-year Treasury will go up. Actually, if we go back through history, there's a very low correlation. When interest rates have risen by the Fed in the past, actually longer-term rates have actually declined because of the slowing of the economic environment that occurs. So, right now we have interest rates that are just a little above 2% on the 10-year Treasury. The Fed starts raising interest rates. The first interest rate hike, not much of a consequence there, and I think you're right. I think a lot of that's already baked into the market at this point. But let's not forget, the reason that we raise interest rates is to slow economic growth, to stem the pressures of inflation. That's why we raise interest rates. There is no economic growth and there is no inflation. So the problem for the Fed is how much room do they have to actually raise rates? Now, here's why they want to raise rates. In my opinion, the Federal Reserve knows that we are closer to the next economic recession than not. Just normal business cycles. I'm not saying that there's anything, happening next month, but just in a normal business cycle, we are over 6 years into the current economic expansion. Those don't last forever. The Fed's worst fear is getting caught in a recession at 0% rates. They have absolutely no monetary policy tool at their disposal. My concern is, or my thought process is that they're going to raise rates knowing that they will very likely trigger the next recession, but that is the lesser of two evils.
It's interesting. I did an editorial off the top of the show today talking about the push by people like Larry Summers and other academics and others about the cashless society. I believe that's one of the reasons. They want, they don't want to have this zero lower bound anymore. And so it's going to be very interesting. They're going to force people to spend by having, as they have in 9 European countries, negative interest rates. But I think you're absolutely right on that. They want some room to maneuver. Let me come back to the stocks then. I love your expression. I think you were saying something like, you better be wary like a bear, but act like a bull. Because, and I think, by the way, you're to be congratulated on that because you're seeing the market as it is. As you say, who cares what I think? Look at the market. It's given us signals that it wants to go higher. I think that's the right approach.
Well, and it is, the kind of the theory behind that article, Think Like a Bear, Invest Like a Bull, was all the pushback that John Hussman, who manages Hussman Funds, gets. He's been very bearish on the markets. His analysis is spot on. But the reality is that when you have the Federal Reserve, and not just the Federal Reserve, every central bank in the world, ECB, Japan, China, everybody else flooding the system with liquidity, there is nowhere for that money to go. It's called TINA. There is no alternative. And at this point, that is the mentality of the markets. TINA. There is no alternative. You can't put it in bonds. You can't put it in cash. It's got to go into stocks. So as investors, we have to participate when markets are rising, but we have to understand that comes with a great deal of risk. And the thing that I see more than anything else right now is a huge level of complacency by individuals who just think that this time is different. Of course, as we know, those are the most dangerous words ever in the financial markets. Those always end badly. This, too, will end badly. We will wind up with another major financial reversion at some point in the future. I don't know when it's going to be, but we do need to be aware of the risks. That's why I always say you have to think like a bear. Look for the risk. Look what's going to take away your capital when you least expect it. But we have to remain invested while markets are rising.
One of the things that I never anticipated, I never saw the degree to which the central banks were willing to go. That they were willing to create this level of cash, turn right around and just buy or facilitate the buying of government bonds. I'm just one of those guys who sits there and go, it's all so phony, but I agree completely with you. The market is the recipient and the beneficiary of this.
Well, look, you and I agree. Back in 2009, I wrote an article, 8 Reasons for a Bull Market, and I said, markets are so overblown at that point, you're going to get a rally in the markets, especially when the Federal Reserve first came in with QE1. That was kind of the initial push for stocks. At that point, I never imagined that stocks would be able to rally in the economic environment in which we have lived in for the last 5 years, the stocks would have rallied as much as they have. It's beyond comprehension. It's beyond fundamentals by any stretch of the imagination. This is simply a liquidity-driven surge. And again, that can only last, and people need to understand this, is that a liquidity-driven surge can only last as long as there's liquidity. Raising interest rates, stopping QE, that is removal, that is tightening of monetary policy, that is the removal of liquidity from the market, which is a dangerous step at the point of the markets that we are in.
Well, that brings me back to, as I say, I don't want to be in that complacent camp, but I also believe that central banks have proven, to me at least, they will do whatever it takes. That's the famous line out of Mario Draghi, I think, in July of 2012 about Europe. And I wish I'd taken him more seriously at that time, because there was a fortune to be made in Spanish bonds, which I never saw coming. I mean, my goodness, Spanish bonds yielding under U.S. bonds as if they're more creditworthy. It tells you how fanciful the whole economic structure is.
Right.
And but I do believe that they're prepared to do absolutely any level of manipulation necessary.
Yes, and I don't disagree with you. But it's important to understand, though, that there are limits to every sort of manipulation. There are limits. Now, I don't know what those limits are, right? The limit, the actual limit, is how many bonds can you buy. There is only a finite number of bonds available, and the central banks cannot literally own every single bond that is available because you will have no credit market. As you know and I know, credit markets are far more important to the global economy than the stock markets are, because credit is the lifeblood of business. Literally, the banks cannot absorb every single bond. So there is a limit. I just don't know when that limit is going to be reached. And that's the problem for all investors, is understanding and being able to react to the bang moment when we get there.
Well, I'd also add that they cannot manipulate everything. So, for example, right now we're going to get bankruptcies in emerging markets because they borrowed so much money in U.S.-denominated bonds. So they couldn't control that aspect. So I think that's the kind of stuff that's going to hit the fan. Hey, we've only got a couple minutes left, Lance. Let me just throw it right at you. Let's talk to investors directly here. Sort of set the stage for them. What should investors be thinking about right now?
This summer, I think there's a real potential that we could see a bit of a correction in the markets. Now, I'm not talking about the next major financial crash, but we are long overdue for a financial correction of 10 to 15%. There is more equity outflows coming out of the market right now than actually going in. The support for the S&P and the other financial markets has been foreign buying of U.S. stocks because of the surge in the U.S. dollar. If that comes to an end, and I think we will see that come to an end this summer, we could see a bit of a reversion of the market. So short term, I would take some profits here, remain a little bit cautious through the summer months, and look for a buying opportunity later this summer if we do have some sort of correction.
Well, I think it's also great advice in that, we don't need to make every dime that's on the table. That's a mistake that investors make too regularly. I've made it myself in the past, but it's a mistake that's too common. There's some very, very prominent and successful investors who are sort of pulling in their horns, as you've just described, Lance. And I just think, who would be surprised at that, if you know what I mean, when you say there's a correction that's of some significance, 10, 15%, how could you be surprised? So, yeah, I think that's great advice you're giving us.
Well, and look, remember, our job as investors are very simple. We have to sell high in order to buy low, and for some reason we always forget that. But that is our job as investors.
Great stuff as usual. Lance, thanks for finding time for us this weekend.
As always, anytime you want, let me know. Now,
listen to this. You can go to www.streettalklive.com, streettalklive.com. You go across the top. They have a newsletter to click on. You click on the newsletter. Get the X Factor report. It's absolutely free. You can get the daily updates, too, from Lance, but go to streettalklive.com, X Factor report. It's a newsletter. It's one of the little click-ons on top.